So the next input is from Warrick, and Warrick is a mechanical engineer and an energy economist. He specializes in techno-economic modeling and transdisciplinary analysis, specifically energy systems modeling. Warrick has published widely, has 3 master's degrees, including renewable energy and energy economics and policy. And he's the principal researcher and head of the energy systems modeling at the CSIR's Energy Center. So Warrick is going to give us some input on CSIR's experience around modeling and integrated energy planning. So Warrick, if you're ready, please go for it.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. So just first of all, so as mentioned, I'm Warrick Pierce from the CSIR. I'm the lead on energy systems modeling. So it's actually just first of all to say thank you. It's a great opportunity. We normally engage with municipalities sort of one-on-one, specifically in the field of municipal electricity master planning, but today provides an opportunity to engage with numerous municipalities at one stage. So the topic is local integrated planning or municipal electricity master planning. So the whole question that we're trying to get to is say, well, there are options for municipalities, and we're seeing, for instance, that you just saw the presentation from Hendrik Raedeni, that there's a lot of work being done in that field. So we're just trying to go, so this presentation is to sort of take you through the process. Okay, so just a rough agenda. So starting point is why it's tough being in your shoes. Then energy systems modeling at CSR, themes and trends in energy planning, what we're seeing locally, what we're seeing internationally, and then what are the options available to municipalities. So we know quite a lot of your problems and what the issues are, and then finally a case study with the Garden Route District Municipality. So most of the work is actually going to be done, time is going to be spent on sort of the latter part of the agenda. So why it's being tough being in your shoes. So just sort of maybe
Warrick, just to, I'm not sure if it's because I'm part of the presenting panel, but what I see is your presentation plus your next slide next to it.
Sorry, let me just see. There should be a switch.
Yeah.
I apologize. That is now fine?
There we go.
Thanks for that, Mark. So my background has been doing quite a few cost of supply studies for municipalities, including some the metros as well. So I've got a sort of fairly good understanding of, why it's tough being in your shoes, and just try to sort of highlight it in 1 or 2 slides. So sort of the main things, I think the issues that you guys are facing at the moment is significant increases in costs. So first of all, most municipalities are completely or mostly reliant on Eskom purchases, which make up sort of 3/4 of your total costs in terms of your bulk purchases. So we know that we're currently in an electricity crisis for quite a while. It's not just a sort of capacity crisis anymore, it's also an energy crisis as well. So, and this is leading to load shedding, which means that your customers are not being provided reliable electricity. Then obviously a big issue that we're seeing with cost of supply studies is concerns around loss of revenue. And I see there was a question around this in terms of, well, there's reduced demand. So we're selling less electricity because essentially that there's not many drivers for pushing demand up. Most are pushing demand down, for instance, higher prices for electricity, lower economic growth, and unreliable supply. So, and then we're seeing a sort of push towards embedded generation, mostly rooftop solar PV. So a lot of your customers are installing solar PV, and thus they're reducing their demand. The problem is you've got the higher purchases cost on the other side with these lower revenues based on reduced demand, but you've got a fixed network, sort of your wires and retail costs that need to be recovered. So it's, in some ways, I have a lot of sympathy for the municipalities at the moment. So the thing with energy planning is that we know that the electricity supply industry, so the market is evolving. So 2 things I would just like to say is that your business model should be evolving as well. And I know this has probably been dealt with by in previous sessions, the likes of At van der Merwe and Vali sort of talk about this, about how your business model should be evolving. The other thing that should be evolving is your planning. So the fairly, well, you can't solve today's problems with yesterday's solutions, methods, and tools. This has been attributed to Albert Einstein. And essentially, it's the same thing with energy planning. If you're using the same tools that you were using 10 years ago, you probably have a problem. So there's 2 status quos that might not be good for you anymore, that you might need to start questioning. And one of them is is who you are as a municipality. And so remaining a traditional bulk reseller of electricity might not be the best way forward. And then also the what, which is the remaining solely dependent on one supply. And essentially that is what municipal electricity master planning is about, is to say currently your business as usual is to buy from Eskom, either 99% or 100% of your electricity comes from there. So the whole point of a municipal electricity master plan is to say, well, what are your alternatives to that? So just briefly, what we're sort of doing at the CSIR. So the CSIR is a research arm of government. So we do a lot of state-to-state work, and we do a lot of private sector work as well. Which is why we sort of fairly active in the municipal space, because it's state-to-state. So the energy systems modeling, the team that I'm part of, falls under energy systems, which falls under the Energy Research Center, commonly known as the Energy Center, which is the smart places clusters. So you don't need to go into too much detail on this slide. We're just sort of saying there's 3 programs. The first one is sort of looking at full sector modeling, so to go beyond just IOP modeling kind of work. Program B is to say, well, what is the future of South Africa's electricity supply industry? So we do a lot of the historical data on statistics that we've got there. And then by the end of this year, we'll be updating the IOP in terms of giving a version, the CSI version of the IOP. Then the last program, which is specific to today, is about providing municipal business model support. And the first one that we did is the municipal regional electricity master plans, which essentially is sort of a lot of the skills that we've developed with the IRP is being used for this municipal electricity master planning as well. It's a very similar kind of concept. The one is done for a national level, where the municipal electricity master plan is done for a municipality, so more a regional, local level. So again, don't want to spend too much time on this, but we all know the electricity supply industry, generation, transmission, and distribution. The CSIR's research and energy planning's research in general, I suppose you could say, has been sort of focused on generation. We've actually moving more towards what we're seeing, because the market is moving more towards distribution, because distribution is where the actual transaction is occurring. So that's where the retail is happening. So we're seeing kind of a follow the money approach in terms of our energy planning research that we're doing. So themes and trends in energy planning. What we're seeing internationally and what we're seeing locally. And the biggest trend by far is electricity liberalization. So this whole concept of before customers could purchase electricity from Eskom or municipality, I mean, this is sort of the definition of a monopoly. There's no options, but we know because of things like embedded generation or specifically solar PV, there are now viable alternatives. So the big thing with electricity liberalization is that the market is no longer captive. Before it was one choice, you get it in, you can choose it in black or black. But now we know that that's not true anymore, because you can see your own customers are starting to exercise their choice in terms of installing rooftop PV. And that same concept is applying to municipalities. Before it was you could just buy from Eskom, but now that's moved towards you can actually purchase from other alternatives, including IPPs, again, like Hendrik Raedeni has shown in the previous presentation. So the big question that you'll see, and this is maybe more for policy, is not so much for municipalities, is how will this choice be governed? And from a municipality point of view, is it something that you want to promote? For instance, rooftop PV, how do you still recover your costs? Those are sort of questions that will be more answered by cost of supply studies, but a municipal electricity master plan can guide the sort of the more long-term future. So just a last one on this is the total demand used to be, so demand is generally measured by supply. So we just assume that all demand is met, and then whatever was supplied by Eskom or whoever's the generator, that was your demand. But we've more recently, we're seeing customer-owned supply is also making a penetration. And this is one of the reasons why I think we get the demand forecasting wrong. It's because we're still assuming total demand is equals utility supply. We're forgetting that utility supply is actually total demand minus customer-owned supply. And that customer-owned supply is what is potentially, since for quite a while, and there's numerous factors to it, increasing prices, unreliability of supply. But from around about 2008, the national electricity demand has, or utility supply demand has flatlined. So Themes and trends in energy planning. Before, energy planning was centralized, sort of done at a fixed level, government level, national, mostly about the electricity sector. I mean, even the word we use energy and we use electricity as synonyms, where it's actually not true. So before, it was very much generation transmission was separate. It was two different things. We had the IRP, and then we have your sort of TDP. The conventional technologies in South Africa, mostly coal, some nuclear, and a little bit of gas. And then customer resources were not considered. So embedded generation was not really part of the equation. But that's all evolved. And this is not just locally, this is internationally. So we're seeing this evolution moving towards still a lot of centralized, but also moving towards decentralized, national to customer level, co-optimization. But again, all of this is moving towards, we had sort of a national IRP, and now we're seeing a general trend towards regional IRP, or you could also see it as a municipal electricity master plan. So the options available to municipalities, I mean, we try to get into sort of the meat of the presentation. So we know there's the electricity liberalization, and we know that there's a choice. We know that your customers are exercising their choice, installing rooftop PV. So that sort of monopoly that you had on the downstream side is being questioned. So I think a logical approach would be to question the monopoly on the upstream side. So before there was option A, which essentially was Eskom. Now you have option A plus alternatives. So from a purely optimization point of view, you've increased your search space. So you can't be worse off than you were before. So you can only be the same or better off. And this is sort of what I'm trying to convey and have some sort of optimism, is that this is good news. The question is, what works for you as a municipality, and what, some municipalities, or each municipality is different. The alternatives can be different. For instance, you might have landfill gas, you might have biomass that's available to you. But the starting point is always the same, regardless of which municipality. You need some sort of scientific analysis, which is where municipal electricity master planning comes into place. So I've sort of grouped municipal electricity master plan and the IRP together here. But so we just to say, first thing is to say what these things are not. So, sort of manage expectations. They're not perfect. They're based on assumptions. You've got all the quote at the bottom, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think we must be careful not to see it as the gospel. Nobody knows the future. For instance, it's not a crystal ball, and it's not a master. And the same that applies to the IOP, that's not a master to the country in terms of decisions we have to make. It provides guidance, it provides information, it provides scientific analysis. So what is a municipal electricity master plan? Also known as capacity expansion planning or generation expansion planning, because it's generally focused on the generation side. So it's long-term planning to ensure the supply meets demand. I mean, that's the fairly short one for it. We know it's forward-looking, but it's informed by the past, so it's quite data-intensive. It's a techno-economic model. So the nice thing with the techno-economic model and a mathematical optimization, it's got no preferences, it's got no desires. It's purely based on the numbers that's included in the modeling. So the constraint is that supply must meet demand. Obviously, that's the constraint that's not being withheld or being held at the moment. And the objective function is least cost, but it can be others as well. You can also, consider greenhouse gas emission reductions, job creation. It's up to the municipality to decide what that objective function is. So in short, it answers what to build, when and how much, and when to retire if you need to retire. So I think we'll try to sort of spend most of our time we've got around about 8 minutes to talk about the Garden Route District Municipality. So last year, the CSR did a project for the Garden Route District Municipality. Maybe just to provide you some background. So on the left of the screen, you can see it's part of the Western Cape province, and it's 7 individual municipalities. So quite rare district municipality in the country. Most commonly people probably know sort of the George and Knysna areas. So just on the right, we're trying to provide the study structure. So the most important part, let me just actually use my laser, yeah. The most important part is to see these. Don't worry too much about the detail inside, but we're trying to focus on these 4 different entities. So before, when you had a monopoly, it was a customer and the utility. So utility can either be the municipality or Eskom. That was the monopoly. There was never technology or local resource in between here. And specifically why we've included these two entities in between customer and the utility is that this technology and this local resource, so for instance, let's say a solar PV panel and the sun on that's available at that roof, they've now changed the game in terms of how you can do the modeling. But the same way that it's changed it for your customers, it can change it for you from a procurement point of view. So then the same sort of phases, which we've seen before, status quo, what is the current situation? What are the current Eskom tariffs? What are the municipalities tariffs? Then we go into a forecast and analysis. And the big ones you have to focus on is demand projections. What is it going to be done? And demand projections need to consider your customer resource, for instance, the rooftop PV analysis. So what are you expecting your customers, how much are they expecting them to install, which then will obviously decrease your demand that you need to supply. And then capacity expansion planning, the kind of work that you would see in terms of, how much wind, how much PV would you need to install. And then obviously the impact assessment, what impact that'll have on in terms of your costs, greenhouse gas emissions, and which other metrics you might be interested in. This is a very busy slide, and I'll take it through slowly and line by line, just to provide a kind of indication of what goes into a municipal electricity master plan. So we spoke about before the status quo. We need to know your customer demand. We need to know your demand, the technology costing, what PV costs, what's open cycle gas turbine costs, what is the gas going to cost, technical performance, the local resource assessment. This is very important that you look at this from a local perspective. The sunshine in Uppington is fairly irrelevant to what it looks like in Durban. So you'll have to then go and actually do a resource assessment for the local municipality, specifically normally solar resource and wind resource. Then we have the electrical network constraints, which will be discussed today. And then also what's important is obviously the tariffs that will be current tariffs. And then the forecast and analysis is saying, okay, well, this is what we've seen now in the status quo, but how is this going to look like into the future? So I know the previous presenter also mentioned about, megaflex being difficult to predict. It is true, because it's not just about what the megaflex is today and what you're being charged by Eskom today, but what do you think you're going to be charged in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? So the key ones there is in terms of your demand forecast. So what are you planning for? That's the key question that's been asked. And we know on a national level, we've had declining demand. So any municipality that sort of says, they're expecting their demand to increase, there should be a good reason why they're expecting that. Then learning rates in terms of your technologies. What do we think the cost of PV is? We know what it is right now. What do we think it's going to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Then the rooftop PV analysis, which is something I'll quickly take you through in terms of what we did at the Garden Route District Municipality, and then assumed wheeling charges. So you'll see under the next one, which is the capacity expansion planning. So what are your utility scale options? You need to understand, you can either look at it from a nodal point of view. So each region, for instance, in the Garden Route, each one of those individual municipalities could be seen as a node, or you can see the region as a whole. So what is the optimal for the node versus what is the optimal for the region? So, and then that brings us to the scenarios. Obviously, your business as usual, which would be your baseline, typically to continue buying electricity as you're buying it from now, which is for most municipalities, 100% Eskom, versus, as I mentioned there, the least cost, either nodal versus regional, and autonomy. So autonomy is just it's a scenario that we typically do to show what would be required to disconnect from the network. It's quite an academic process, but it just gives you an indication of sort of the minimum cost to do so. And then we try to answer the questions in terms of what to build, which is dependent on the candidate technologies for the municipalities. Your gas turbines, open cycle, internal combustion, PV. We both look at fixed tilt and single axis tracking, and then wind, which is very much dependent on the local resource. And then we have the impact assessment. But while we have some time, we can show you some cool stuff that we did with the rooftop PV analysis. It's the first kind of work that I've seen being done on it, and made mostly available by the data that I'll show you a little later on. So there's 3 main steps. Step 1 is determine the technical potential and based on available rooftops. So essentially you're measuring the rooftops out there within your municipality, and then how much of that is actually available to put PV on it. Then the next step is to calculate the business model for rooftop PV, which depends on both the municipality's tariffs, current and projected, and then the costs of the solar PV installation, current and projected. And then from 1 and 2, plus numerous other factors, you try and estimate an adoption rate, which is quite useful there in terms of calibrating if you have historic data. So what we're seeing on here is the rooftop PV, trying to figure out what's the available rooftop space. It's a GIS process. So we obviously have the municipal boundaries, and then what we can see with these shapes over here, we're seeing the yellow and the blue. This is the different sectors. Yellow in this, for instance, is commercial properties. Blue is residential properties. So this has been made available. It's in the public domain. Google Open Buildings data, only released last year for the whole of Africa. So very useful tool or data set for us to use. So then we take this kind of information that we're seeing here, divided into the different customer classes: residential, commercial, industrial, and maybe agricultural if you're interested in that as well. And then what's quite important is to do a sort of a random sampling where we say, okay, well, if this is giving us X meters squared, how much of this is actually available for rooftop PV? And then to provide some results, skipping a whole bunch of parts, but to provide some sort of in terms of the results on the rooftop PV analysis. So this is for the Garden Route District municipalities, those 7 individual municipalities that we mentioned earlier. So what we're seeing here is just this axis is megawatts, so solar PV megawatts that could be installed. The 3 different colors: the blue is residential, orange is commercial, and gray is industrial. So for instance, this municipality here you can see is around about, more than 300 megawatts can be installed on residential use, and then probably 100 or so could be done on commercial, and then I don't know, 70 or 60 could be done on industrial. So this is identifying the available rooftop space. So this all comes out to, for this region, around about 1,750 megawatts, which is around about 7 times greater than the maximum demand for the Garden Route District municipality region. So it's just showing that there's a significant amount of roof space. And then what we do is we just do it's a very academic exercise, but we ask the question, okay, so how much of, so for instance, this blue space over here, how much of this, let's call it 300 megawatts, needs to be installed to provide the magnitude, so the annual requirement for this customer. So this residential customer in municipality B, how much of this needs to be installed? This 300 megawatts needs to be installed. And we say, well, 33%. So only 100 megawatts needs to be installed, which then will provide the volumetric amount for that customer group. Obviously,
Warrick, sorry to interrupt. Could you wrap up in the next few minutes?
Yeah, this is the second last slide, so I'll wrap up now. So we can see that there's more than enough. So the first thing is to sort of say, well, most of this is under residential. Other thing is to say that residential is more than enough. Commercial is also got enough. Where industrial, which we found, which makes sense, is there's actually not enough roof space in industrial, which makes sense in terms of the sort of the power density that's required. But in short, only 36% of this identified roof space, installable roof space, needs to be utilized to provide 100% of the magnitude, not timing, but magnitude of electricity for this region. So then last slide, the key takeaways. So just to kind of provide an indication of what are the possibilities from municipal electricity master planning and what your expectations can be in terms of outcomes. So the first part is obviously the rooftop PV, where we showed that rooftop PV can play a significant role in the electricity future of the region. Decision makers should be mindful of this customer resource and promote the responsible, sustainable utilization thereof. Each municipality will then have to need to discuss what that actually means for them. But again, by utilizing 36% of the space, you can provide the total annual needs. So there's ample roof space. So if municipalities are wondering, are there enough roof space? Yes, there is. Then on the utility scale generation alternatives, the key takeaways that we found from this, and this is probably from around about the last 3 or so studies that we've done, is that doing nothing is expensive. It's really to continue with business as usual. You can do that, but there's high opportunity cost because there's really significant cost savings to invest in alternatives. So for instance, in this Garden Route District municipality, which in some ways could be seen as on the higher level because the amount of procurement was unconstrained, you can look at 25% reduction in your total costs over the period of, say, 2022 to 2040. which is significant based on the fact that you're starting with 100% Eskom. Then also the environmental costs also provides, you can reduce half of your greenhouse gas emission reductions. Then wheeling of electricity within the region can further reduce costs, environmental impacts and reliance on Eskom. But this is obviously dependent on what those wheeling charges would be. Then a final, and I know we've only got a few sort of 30 seconds left. There might be, I've seen it in some media sort of outlets that we should disconnect from Eskom, and this is the optimal solution, and we're gonna provide so from a techno-economic point of view, in terms of your least cost solution, it is not optimal to disconnect from Eskom. So I think the point is that there are alternatives to Eskom, but right now with the current pricing and with the foreseeable future, it doesn't make techno-economic sense to disconnect from Eskom, but it does make a lot of sense to provide alternatives to Eskom. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Warrick. A lot of quite significant findings there. So thanks very much for that input, and great to have CSR capacity available to municipalities.